They said it wasn't possible. The doctors shook their heads, the staff at the venue insisted, and the parents' pleas went unanswered. The baby was too sick, too fragile, too weak to be in such a crowded, noisy place. For the young couple who had spent months praying for their child's survival, the words cut deeper than any diagnosis. They had one dream, just one, that before time ran out, their baby might feel the warmth of Elvis Presley's voice, see him, even for a fleeting moment. But that dream was turned aside with a cold, bureaucratic refusal. The mother clutched her child tighter, as if by sheer force of love she could will the world to bend. The father stood there, hands trembling, caught between anger and despair. They had written letters, begged backstage staff, even tried reaching someone in Elvis's circle, but all they received were polite apologies or flat denials. It's not safe, it's not possible, maybe another time. Another time, those two words stung the most, because for this child there might not be another time. In that dimly lit hospital room, the sound of machines filled the silence where hope used to live. The parents sat at the bedside, whispering stories to a baby too weak to understand them. They whispered of Elvis's songs, of the power of his music to lift hearts when nothing else could. For them, Elvis wasn't just a singer, he was a source of strength, a reminder that beauty and kindness still existed in the world. And all they wanted was for their child to feel that light, even once, before the darkness came. Unbeknownst to them, somewhere else in town, their story was making its way across whispered lips. A sympathetic nurse passed it to a cousin. A stagehand overheard the details and carried them into the wings of Graceland's buzzing world. In the kind of chain only fate seems able to forge, the story reached Elvis himself. He had heard many things in his life, fan letters poured in daily, each more desperate than the last. But this one froze him where he stood. A child too sick to attend his concert, a family begging for a chance that had been denied. The words lingered like a thorn in his chest. He knew what it meant to feel powerless. He knew the sting of watching someone you love fade and being unable to stop it. Memories of his own twin brother, Jesse, who never took a breath in this world, returned to him with brutal clarity. He thought of his mother, of her quiet sacrifices, of the times he had stood by helpless as illness or grief swept through his family. Elvis set the letter down but couldn't set aside the ache it stirred. He paced the room, his heart heavy, his mind restless. He thought about the image the world had of him, the king of rock and roll, adored by millions, untouchable, larger than life. But none of that mattered here. This wasn't about fame or stages or glittering lights. This was about a single child, a single family, crushed beneath the weight of life's cruelty. The staff had said the baby couldn't be there, but Elvis asked himself a question no one else seemed to consider. If the baby couldn't come to him, then why couldn't he go to the baby? The very thought seemed impossible. Elvis Presley, the most recognizable man in America, sneaking into a modest home or hospital without the world finding out. The risks were endless. Fans could swarm, reporters could twist the story, security could unravel in chaos. But Elvis didn't think like that. His mind was already fixed on something else, a promise forming silently in his chest. For him, the refusal wasn't the end of the story, it was the spark, and once it lit, there was no turning back. He didn't announce it to his entourage, he didn't call a press conference, he didn't even tell most of his family, he simply whispered, almost to himself, "Then I'll go to them." Those 6 words carried the weight of everything he was. A man who remembered hunger and heartbreak, who understood how it felt to be ignored, dismissed, and left behind. A man who had seen both sides of life, the rags and the riches, and knew that love was the only bridge strong enough to carry someone through despair. That night, as the news of the denial faded into the routine of hospital corridors and weary staff, the parents sat in silence, tears slipping down their cheeks. They believed their hope had been extinguished. What they didn't know was that, in the quiet of Graceland, Elvis Presley had already decided their story wasn't over. The world may have said no, but Elvis was about to answer in a way no one expected. And that answer would not only change the memory of one desperate family, it would reveal a side of him the world rarely saw. The decision had been made, and once Elvis Presley made up his mind, there was no reversing it. But this wasn't a choice made on impulse or vanity. It was born out of a raw, aching need to do something human, something kind, without the noise of the cameras or the weight of expectation. He knew the dangers. A single rumor could spark chaos. Crowds of fans might follow him, turning a sacred private moment into a circus. Worse yet, the press could paint it as a stunt, a headline-grabbing gesture rather than what it truly was, a man's quiet promise to a family in pain. That thought alone made Elvis tighten his circle to the smallest it had ever been. Only one trusted aide was told, sworn to secrecy with the kind of look that made clear there would be no second chances. No limousines this time, no sparkling Cadillac that screamed wealth. Instead, Elvis requested a nondescript car, something so ordinary it would draw no second glance on the backroads of Memphis. He pulled a plain jacket from his closet, one that made him look less like the king of rock and more like a tired working man. His famous hair was covered, his rings and flashy jewelry left behind. For this mission, anonymity wasn't just helpful, it was essential. But more than disguises and secrecy, Elvis carried something else into that night: memory. The story of that sick baby had stirred something far older than his fame. He thought of Tupelo, of his boyhood days when poverty pressed so close that every meal felt like a miracle. He remembered the days his mama skipped supper so he could eat, the hand-me-down clothes that never quite fit, the quiet dignity with which his parents carried burdens no child should ever have to witness. And above all, he remembered Jesse, his twin brother who never made it past birth. The absence had never left him. In every photograph, in every quiet night at Graceland, in every song sung to an empty room, Jesse's shadow lingered. Perhaps that was why this baby's story cut so deep. Elvis knew what it meant for a family to ache for a child they couldn't keep. He knew the cruel silence left in the wake of loss. And maybe, just maybe, he thought, if he could bring even one moment of joy into that house, he would be giving back something that had been denied to him and his family decades before. The car ride was quiet, deliberately so. No radio, no chatter, just the low hum of the engine against the cool Tennessee night. Elvis sat in the back, his eyes fixed on the blur of passing lights. Every turn of the wheels carried him closer to a place where his fame meant nothing, where his songs weren't chart toppers, but prayers. He thought about the risk. What if word got out? What if fans stormed the house, shattering the fragile peace the family desperately needed? What if the baby's health faltered while he was there? Would people blame him? His name was already heavy with responsibility, and the last thing he wanted was to add weight to a family already drowning in sorrow. But despite every question, every doubt, his resolve never wavered. He knew in his heart that this wasn't about risk management or reputation. It was about love. As the car turned onto a quieter street, Elvis leaned forward, asking the driver to slow down. Rows of modest homes came into view, ordinary houses where ordinary people lived lives filled with extraordinary struggle. These weren't the mansions of Hollywood, nor the opulence of Las Vegas. These were the places where mothers prayed over fevers, fathers worked long hours to keep the lights on, and children dreamed of better tomorrows. Elvis had lived this life once. He hadn't forgotten it. The aide beside him gave a final rundown of the plan: no knocking on the front door, no scene to alert the neighbors. They would approach quietly, respectfully, as visitors, not intruders. Elvis nodded, his jaw set, his heart beating harder than it had on any stage. This was no performance. There would be no encore, no applause, only a family clinging to hope and a man determined to deliver it. The car slowed to a crawl outside the house. From the window, Elvis could see a dim glow from inside, the kind of light that never truly went out in homes touched by sickness, part vigil, part necessity. He imagined the parents inside, exhausted, hunched over a crib or hospital cot, whispering lullabies into the stillness. He imagined their tears, their whispered prayers, their fragile faith that somehow someone out there would care enough to listen. Elvis took a deep breath. His hand lingered on the car door handle, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't about songs or shows. It wasn't about the king of rock and roll. This was about a man walking into a room where the only thing that mattered was whether he could bring a flicker of light into unbearable darkness. He looked once more at his aide, who gave the smallest of nods, then back at the quiet little house. The world outside had no idea what was about to happen. The fans would go on screaming for him in arenas, the press would keep printing headlines, and the music industry would keep counting sales. But inside that house, in the shadows of one family's suffering, something infinitely greater was about to unfold. Elvis exhaled slowly, opened the car door, and stepped out into the cool night air. The door creaked open, and the parents froze, unable to believe the figure standing in the shadows of their small living room. At first, they thought it was a neighbor, maybe a kind friend come to bring food or offer company. But as the man stepped forward, the faint light from a lamp caught his face, and the mother gasped so sharply it seemed her heart might stop. It was him. Elvis Presley stood in their home, not the dazzling figure from magazine covers or concert posters, but a quiet, humble man dressed simply, eyes softened with the weight of what he had come to do. The father, still in disbelief, stammered, searching for words, but none came. The mother clutched her child closer, tears streaming down her cheeks before she had even spoken. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. The world seemed to pause, and all that could be heard was the shallow breathing of the fragile baby. Then Elvis broke the silence, his voice low, gentle, almost reverent. "I heard about your little one," he said softly, "and I couldn't let you come to me, so I came to you." The mother's knees nearly buckled at the words, and the father guided her to a chair, still trying to take in the sight before him. This wasn't a fantasy. This wasn't a dream conjured by desperation. The most famous man in America was standing in their modest home, not as a performer, not as a celebrity, but as a human being who had chosen to walk through their door. Elvis's eyes fell to the baby. The child's skin was pale, the small chest rising and falling in fragile, uneven breaths. Tubes and bandages marked a struggle no child should ever face. Elvis approached slowly, his steps deliberate, as though he were entering holy ground, and in a way he was. With a tenderness that surprised even the parents, Elvis reached out his hands. "May I hold him?" he asked. The mother's lips trembled, but she nodded, her tears falling freely now. Carefully, Elvis lifted the baby into his arms, the weight so small it seemed almost impossible. He cradled the child against his chest, rocking gently, as if instinct alone guided him. For a while no one spoke. The room was filled with something unexplainable, a sacred hush that seemed to swallow every pain, every fear. Elvis's voice broke that silence, not with words, but with a hum. A low, soothing melody, carried not for the crowd, but for this one fragile soul. Slowly, softly, he began to sing. It wasn't one of the stadium-shaking numbers that made him famous. It was something simpler, gentler, a gospel tune his mother once sang to him when he was a boy too restless to sleep. His voice, rich and warm, wrapped around the baby like a blanket. And then something happened. The child stirred, the frail eyes opened, fluttering, as though the sound was pulling him back from the edge. The corners of the baby's lips twitched, forming the faintest trace of a smile. The mother gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. The father's eyes flooded, his jaw trembling as he watched the impossible unfold. For those few precious moments, the sickness seemed to loosen its grip. The baby's tiny hand reached upward, brushing against Elvis's chest, as if to hold on to the vibration of his voice. Elvis's own eyes glistened, his song breaking just enough to reveal the depth of his emotion. He pressed his cheek, gently, against the baby's forehead, whispering words no one else could hear. Time stretched. For the parents, it felt eternal. For Elvis, it was as though he had been placed there for this single purpose. He wasn't the king of rock and roll in that moment. He was a vessel of comfort, a stranger who had come to ease suffering, a man whose own scars gave him the ability to understand theirs. Finally, when his song faded into silence, Elvis sat with the child still nestled in his arms. The baby's breathing had steadied, the lines of pain softened. The parents sat in stunned reverence, their tears falling quietly, their hearts both breaking and healing in the same instant. Elvis looked up at them, his voice quiet but steady. "You're not alone," he said. "I can't promise miracles, but I can promise you this: love will never leave this house, not as long as you keep it alive in your hearts." The father swallowed hard, unable to speak, but he nodded, his whole body trembling with gratitude. The mother leaned forward, her hand brushing against Elvis's arm as if to anchor herself in reality. And then outside, the faint sound of footsteps crunched in the gravel. A neighbor walking late at night caught sight of the unusual car parked outside, the dim light glowing in the window, and the unmistakable outline of a man holding something close. They slowed their pace, curiosity rising. Something extraordinary was happening inside that house, something no one else in the world would believe unless they saw it with their own eyes. But inside, no one noticed. For in that moment, in that small living room heavy with sorrow, Elvis Presley had given a gift greater than fame, greater than fortune. He had given presence, he had given love, and he had given a family the kind of memory that would outlast even the deepest grief. When Elvis finally laid the baby back into the mother's arms, he did so as gently as if he were handing over the most precious jewel in the world. His eyes lingered for a moment longer, then he stood, slipping his hands into his pockets as though anchoring himself from the tide of emotions swelling around him. He didn't ask for thanks, didn't wait for praise. Instead, he said quietly, "This stays between us. This was for your family, not for the world." The parents nodded, unable to speak through their tears. They had lived through nights of despair, of hopeless silence broken only by the whir of hospital machines, but tonight was different. Tonight, love itself had walked through their door. They would carry that memory as long as they lived. Elvis left the house the way he entered, without spectacle, without noise. The aide followed, silent, understanding the gravity of what had just taken place. The car pulled away into the night, leaving behind only the echo of his presence and a story too fragile to tell. For Elvis, that was enough. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was chasing meaning. And sometimes meaning is found not on a stage, but in a quiet room where a single family clings to hope. For years, the story never surfaced. The parents respected Elvis's wish. They told no one, except a trusted neighbor who had glimpsed the shadows through the window that night and whispered about it in hushed tones. It wasn't until later, long after the baby's struggle had ended, that pieces of the truth began to ripple outward. A family friend mentioned it. A nurse confirmed a late-night visit. Slowly, the legend grew. When people finally spoke of it, they didn't talk about Elvis the star, the man who filled stadiums and shattered records. They spoke of Elvis, the man who showed up when no one else would. They told of his tenderness, his humility, and the way his voice, so often a symbol of fame, became, for one child, a lullaby meant only for them. What mattered most wasn't whether the baby survived or whether the moment lasted hours or minutes. What mattered was that Elvis gave the family something no medicine, no doctor, no staff member could provide: dignity in the middle of despair. He made them feel seen, heard, and loved, not as nameless faces in a crowd, but as human beings whose pain mattered. And in that way, the story became larger than the night itself. It became part of his quiet legacy, woven into the fabric of who Elvis Presley truly was. Not just the king of rock and roll, not just the man who dazzled audiences in Vegas, but the man who understood loss, who carried his own grief like a shadow, and who used his fame not to elevate himself, but to kneel beside those in need. For those who heard the story later, it changed something. Fans no longer saw only the glittering jumpsuits and the roaring crowds. They saw a man who slipped away from the spotlight to comfort a dying child. They saw a man who carried compassion into living rooms and hospital wards with the same reverence he carried onto the stage. It is easy to think of Elvis Presley as untouchable, a figure carved into the myth of American culture. But that night reminds us he was something even rarer. He was present, present for the strangers who needed him most, present for the quiet, painful moments that never make it into the history books, present in a way that proved true greatness isn't measured in record sales or box office receipts, it's measured in compassion. Years later, when whispers of that night circled through fans and biographers, the question was always the same: why didn't he tell the world? Why keep it hidden? The answer was simple. Elvis knew that some acts of love are too sacred to be turned into performance. Some gifts are meant only for the hearts that receive them. And that night, his gift was for one baby, one family, one home lit by fragile hope. To the world, Elvis Presley will always be the king. But to that family, he was something greater: an angel in denim, a man who brought peace where there was none, and a memory that would shine brighter than any stage light. And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy of Elvis Presley, that when the world said no, he said yes. When doors closed, he opened them. And when despair seemed final, he answered with love.